Time for another update on the process of replacing the 34 horsepower 660cc engine that came in my 1997 Subaru Sambar Diaz Classic with something a little more powerful. In the last update, you saw that I was making progress building a cradle to support the Volkswagen powertrain. If this is your first view into this documentary, be aware that I'm not an expert, not a real mechanic, and I'm not a fabricator. I'm an average Joe with some cheap tools and some space to work. As it turned out, there was a lot more that I would have to figure out and create to support this cradle. My progress is really slow, but I have in fact made some progress since the last update. So let's dig in. The pair of tube ends that you see here will be connecting to the original forward mounting point of the van, which used to connect with a bracket to the Subaru's transaxle. Just behind that, you see a platform I'm developing to provide one of the engine mount points. Here are the specific motor mounts I'm using. The mount has a tang on the bottom, presumably to discourage it from spinning under dynamic loading. So I cut the steel to accommodate this. I had to make a cantilever bracket to attach this engine mount to the engine block while avoiding things like oil ports and the drive axle. Like most of the steel plate you see, this is 1/4 inch. I tried taking measurements, but in reality I just ended up bending and testing over and over until the bracket fit. If I try to make something from just measurements, I'll miss by a mile. These plates will be the end of the cantilever and will rest on top of the engine mount. I took off the sharp edges so I don't open an artery every time I reach in to check the oil. Obviously, the clearance will be tight here. The shaft will move up relative to the motor mount each time the suspension is compressed by a bump. But the closer to the transaxle, the smaller that movement will be. I think that even at maximum suspension compression, there will be at least 1/16 of an inch clearance. And as for the engine torque moving the engine during acceleration, the crankshaft rotates clockwise, so it will push the rest of the powertrain counterclockwise, which is away from the shaft. On to the right rear mount now. You saw the construction of the mounting platform in an earlier video update, and now it's time to attach the top of the mount to the engine block. My idea here is 2 bars arranged perpendicular to one another. I'm not able to measure and cut to specifications in just one try, so I cut things a little long and go back and forth from the grinder to the workpiece until it just fits. At this point, I believe I have the mounts at the right height and position to support the engine. So here goes the first time the engine rests on the cradle. The wooden dolly I made initially stuck to the powertrain due to the tight nature of the fit. Before I could take the dolly off, I realized that I did not have the left side supported sufficiently, and that was another reason the wooden dolly didn't release when I lowered the table. There will need to be additional mounting support in this area. Fortunately, there are a couple of mounting points on the transaxle that will work well. So I pulled out more plate steel and I marked up my lines. I scrolled through the net and found a mount that looks like it will be a good fit, and I dipped into the engine swap budget for the 500th time, I think. Here's my next mistake, thinking that a 3/8 inch junk steel carriage bolt would be strong enough to serve in this role. Right after mounting this, I realized the error and I went looking for some hardened steel. I found a shaft from an old drill press that was forged. It would be plenty strong, but the diameter would need to be reduced. So I spent yet more time at my bench grinder. Here, the engine is fully supported by the cradle. I checked the clearance on things like accessory pulleys and the timing cover. I did not yet know what the real problem would be. About this time, the new Volkswagen axle shaft arrived. This would kick off the process of cutting the Subaru axle so I could use the outer joint and collar, as well as cutting the new Volkswagen shaft so that I could use the VW transaxle interface with the Subaru outer joint. The drive shafts will have to be made into a hybrid in order to maintain my goal of not modifying the Subaru's hub slash brake slash suspension setup. I have not removed the axle shafts from the chassis before this point, as having them in was helpful for visualizing how things would fit together. So I consulted the YouTube channel OK Garage for removal instructions and started wailing on this thing. I bent and destroyed the first center punch that I used because these things are in really tight. I took apart and cleaned the outer CV joint from the Subaru. I will reuse this joint and it will get repacked with grease before final assembly. The inner Subaru CV joint will not be used, so it's being removed and discarded. It's my understanding that manufacturers sometimes use these simple three bearing units on the inside of a drive shaft, and I believe that they only use them in low stress applications, which a K-van would certainly be. The Volkswagen inner joint is a proper 6-point setup capable of dealing with higher power levels. Incidentally, it appears some water got into this CV boot. The grease was fully emulsified. In case it's useful to anyone, here are the shaft diameters of the Volkswagen shaft, then the Subaru shaft, in inches, of course. As I am determining the length of shaft needed, I have a couple of things in mind. First, I want to make sure that I'm placing the thinnest part of this custom axle at the point where there is the least clearance available. In my case, that's probably near the water pump housing. Changing the placement of the water pump or modifying the housing shape to clear the axle is well beyond my abilities, so modifying that is out of the question. Second, as the vehicle moves down the road and encounters dynamic loading, for example, bumps, the wheel, suspension, and axle shaft are going to move up and down relative to the transmission. I believe this will have a small effect on the shaft, which lengthens and shortens the space available for that shaft to occupy. Now, CV joints have built-in features which permit this phenomenon, and the Volkswagen joints I will be using provide about 1.25 inches of total movement in the lateral direction. Incidentally, this also permits the shaft to be installed and removed. If these shafts were completely rigid without any lateral compression or extension available, you would not be able to disconnect the axle shaft without simultaneously removing the transmission. So I think the objective here has to be an axle that, when installed and sitting on level ground, it sees the lateral travel sitting exactly in the center, which is approximately 3/4 of an inch. That would leave an equal amount of lateral travel for both compressing the shaft length and extending it. That's what I'm trying to accomplish here. Here I choose the places to cut the new Volkswagen shaft and the original Subaru shaft with the goal of having the thinnest part of the hybrid shaft land next to the water pump housing. Because there will be a lot of hot sparks flying when I cut and then weld these shafts, I need to protect the rubber boot from burn holes. I used a layer of aluminum duct tape on the bottom and then wrapped several layers of regular aluminum baking foil over that. I had to make similar cuts on both the Subaru and the Volkswagen shafts, so I'll spare you the footage of the second shaft being cut. One thing I did think of was that I should hammer this spindle back into the hub now before I cut the Subaru shaft. It takes a lot of force to reseat the spindle in the hub, and that means I'll be hammering on the end of this shaft. Better to do that on part of the Subaru shaft that will be cut off and discarded than on a freshly cut and properly sized shaft. I also concluded that I needed one additional mount on the rearmost area of the transaxle. The large round mount you've already seen will resist the twisting of the engine under power, and this additional mount will provide stronger horizontal support. So I drilled, cut, hammered, and welded a bracket for this. It occurred to me that I might employ some high density polyurethane as a slight buffer for vibrations. I have no idea how well this will last, but we will see. With that additional mount welded in place, I turned my attention to the process of welding the axle together. My welding table is so thin and flimsy, it's really just a utility cart. So I shimmed some plate steel on top to get a level working surface. My hope was that the machined bottom of the Volkswagen coupling resting against the level plate, I'd be able to position a Subaru shaft plumb and then tack it into place. To get that last tenth of a degree level, I employed a machinist block on top of the steel. Ultimately, I decided that I needed a jig to hold the shaft while I tacked the pieces together. I also added several layers of aluminum foil to protect my machinist's block from the welding splatter. So I laid down 4 tacks and crossed my fingers. Hybrid shaft ready, I installed it for the moment of truth, which quickly turned into a moment of disappointment. The shaft will hit the water pump when the suspension is compressed, so no bueno. This can be resolved, but it means the engine is going to have to shift back, up, or a little bit of both. And that, of course, means redoing the engine mounts. So that's where we are. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I'll be back in 3 weeks.